What is an Englishman? A question which continues to plague conservative politicians and Britain's intelligentsia because they've a priori committed themselves to not ruling anyone out of being classified as English or British or any of the other constituent identities of the nations of these isles because it feels mean and unjust. So they've boxed themselves into having to invent increasingly contradictory criteria that is not fit for purpose by which someone can become English. This was mainly revealed during an exchange between Robert Toombs and the audience at the Now and England conference hosted by the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation in Westminster on Monday. And it has revealed, as part of a pattern of recent events, the conservative obsession with Katherine Birbalsingh's Michaela school as a kind of fix-all model for the failure of integration among first and second generation immigrants in Britain. I, for one, don't want to become the occupant of a strict headmistress state. We're discussing national identity, what it means to be English, and why integration has failed this week on Tomlinson Talks. On Monday in Westminster, the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation hosted the Now and England conference, including speakers like Rupert Lowe, Thomas Skinner, Robert Jenrick, Robert Toombs, Patrick Nash, James Orr, quite a star-studded cast of the intellectuals on the British right. And the final panel was of most interest. The panellists included Danny Kruger, Robert Toombs, Rupert Lowe, and Tom Skinner, the man of Bosch fame. Tom Skinner has been encouraged, of course, to run for London Mayor, and he received a lot of encouragement from the attendants. And thank you to Mr. Skinner for the well wishes for my wedding this week. But the reason that panel was most interesting is because when it got to the Q&A session, there were back-to-back questions about demographics, English identity, and whether or not we will reach a culture and democratic tipping point due to the sheer volume of demographic change. There were 3 questions asked in quick succession. 2 rather concerned Zoomers asked, what if sectarianism turns democracy into a zero-sum game? And what happens when multiculturalism makes our differences irreconcilable? And the 3rd question was asked by my friend and former colleague at lotuseaters.com, Carl Benjamin, who put forward the proposition, if one can self-identify as an Englishman, what are our concerns about demographic change turning white Britons into a minority in their own country founded on? Because if anyone can become an Englishman, why would it matter? And this contradiction strikes at the heart of a uncomfortable and therefore unresolved contradiction in conservative philosophy. And I mean conservative with a big C and a small c in the UK, because the Conservative Party peddled the slur against this nation's indigenous host population that diversity is our strength, implying that if left to our own devices, unmolested by unwanted waves of mass third world migration, that we would somehow be weak, even though we're a much stronger country, which is why all those people want to come here in the first place. But also for the small c, because there is a ecosystem surrounding the Conservative Party and lower C conservative media and politics in this country, a kind of academic and journalistic old guard who still cling to this romantic ideal that if people just learn about Chaucer and Shakespeare and Churchill, then the scales will fall from their eyes and they will ineluctably become British through a period of and process of cultural osmosis. And this just hasn't been the case. I mean, one outstanding example of this is that since October the 7th, 3/4 of Muslims in Britain think Hamas did not commit any atrocities. 52% want to ban drawings and depictions of their prophet Muhammad. About a third of them want Sharia law. And these beliefs are most pronounced among 18 to 30-year-old men who were born in Britain and are university educated. So this is a cross-generational problem that is only getting worse and will continue to get worse because Muhammad is now the #1 baby name in England. Not a creative bunch, are they? By the by, the idea that just reading Roger Scruton will turn any ardent jihadist into a productive and peaceful British citizen is a dangerous delusion, but one that the British intelligentsia continue to indulge in. They continue to indulge in it at this conference, because Robert Tombs' answer, Robert Tombs, who wrote The English and Their History, noted historian, who should understand that the English identity is a consequence of a people in a place over time with an almost interrupted chain of internal conversations about what constitutes law and custom and proper religious practice and culture. And we can name all the figures that contributed to this, let's say Burke and Matthew Arnold and John Locke, possibly, though I think he's done a lot more damage than good. Anyway, this sort of internal conversation has built up the English character until such a point where it thinks that individualistic, liberal self-governance, the sort of spontaneous order that arose in Britain because of its family structures, because of its faith, because of its little platoons of civic organizations that de Tocqueville observed had been exported to America and was actually the reason American civic life thrives so much. Because of all of these factors, they presume that individualism qua liberalism is the default mode of human organization. Alan McFarlane's Origins of English Individualism are very good on this. So you would expect Robert Tombs to know all this. But Robert Tombs responded to those three questions by those three Zoomers by saying, quote, "It's wonderful to see headscarved girls reciting Kipling, singing the national anthem. If only we could clone Katherine Birbalsingh." Now, I, among many, were groaning and protesting in the audience during this. The footage, I expect, will be out eventually. I spoke to the organisers. It isn't readily available at time of filming. However, Tombs was then heckled by the front row, saying that that's nonsensical, that Englishness is connected to ancestry, it is an inherited identity, it is an ethnic identity, and you cannot just assume being English by reciting Kipling's If, or having a wistful affinity for the works of William Shakespeare or for the wartime heroism of Winston Churchill. And Robert Tombs says that's nonsense. Of course you can learn to be English. It's nothing to do with ancestry. And I think the reason that they have fallen upon this indefensible position is because they feel icky about excluding their personal friends from the category of English because they load a lot of moral and historical premium into it. Because the more you learn about your own history, the more you learn about your own faith, your own culture, the more you see of your own country, especially the rich rolling hills, the cultivated countryside, the well-maintained hedgerows, the stone churches, the beautiful towns of Oxford, Cambridge, Bath, in Britain, the more you come to associate your own national identity with all that is good in the world. And so you come to conflate your national identity with a moral judgment. Let me be clear, it is not a moral judgment on a person to say that it would be a category error to call them English if they do not have English ancestry. It is not a condemnation of a person to say, you're not English, you're Japanese, you are Nigerian, you are Pakistani, you are Hungarian. I like some of those nations. I visited them. I think they have lots of good qualities. But it does not mean that just because a Hungarian man has an affinity for the poetry of Keats, Wordsworth and Byron, that he is more British than Keir Starmer, who is a invertebrate traitor, but nevertheless has English ancestry. It might make that man a better neighbour, but it doesn't make him my countryman and my ancestral kin. And that is fine. We are just pointing out category errors here. But the likes of Tombs and Danny Kruger, who was on the panel with him, who noted the thunderous applause that those three questions were given and said, we as parliamentarians now must understand where the conversation is heading before gingerly sidestepping his obligation to actually answer said question very well. They don't like how that makes them feel because they would then have to exclude the friends that they have of different ethnic extractions and possibly even different religions, which we'll come on to in a bit, from consideration as English or even British. Well, I'm sorry, but we must have a country, we must tell the truth, even if that is at the expense of your feelings. And that does not mean that a select few foreign nationals who can meet the very high and traditional bar of entering the tribe through marriage, faith, custom, ritual, and extended dedication to upholding the culture that they've inherited. That does not mean that we can't accommodate some of those people to belong to our British tribe. So I use the example of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's married Neil Ferguson. She's bringing up her children as the custodians of the culture through which they should feel they belong to because of half of their parentage. And because she took flight from her own country under the oppressive circumstances of Islamo-communism, she feels no desire to want to go back and is actually warning us against importing it. The fact that I can name Ayaan Hirsi Ali means she is an exception to the rule, because in aggregate, people that gather together from a certain country make that country. So if you take them out of the country and put them somewhere else, it does not mean that they suddenly become of that country, that they inhale the air of Britain, that they pass through the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick and have British identity and values conferred upon them in a sort of magic spell. Instead, they just recreate the conditions of the third world wherever they come, because it is not the magic soil that makes the people a certain way. It is the people that makes the country a certain way. And this is the old biblical understanding of nations, for example. I mean, I know Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson recently had a set two on whether or not America should have been supporting Israel morally, financially, in its war against various Iranian terror proxies and now the state of Iran itself. I'm not going to get into geopolitics here, mainly because abiding by Douglas Murray's principle, I haven't been. So I think I will hold my tongue on that. Also because I think a lot of the time people talk about these things and they're not in possession of a lot of behind-the-scenes knowledge. So, they'll say, oh, this will lead ineluctably to a ground invasion, but it might not, because they don't know whether or not President Trump's going to do a strike, because they haven't been in the Situation Room. And so, I will hold my tongue on that and not pick a side in either debate. But the reason I bring it up is because Ted Cruz justified his support for Israel by saying that it says in the Bible, those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. And I would like to be on the blessing side. Thank you very much. First of all, Israel is the name given to Jacob because he wrestles with an angel. It means he who wrestles with God, hence why Jordan Peterson used it for his recent book title. But also, Israel refers to a nation, not the geographic landmass of the state of Israel established after 1948, but the people. And we know this because the Jews did not cease to be a distinct people when they lived in exile from Israel in Europe and then the various countries that they were kicked around to after the expulsions in the Middle Ages. The Jews did not cease to be a distinct ethnic group, a distinct religion, a distinct tribe, just because they had lost their place. And so places are defined by peoples. And this is why the British culture, or the English culture, that the likes, or the history, that the likes of Robert Toombs, Sir Neil Ferguson, various Conservative politicians praise and feel is superior to all others. This is why it has the prefix British before it. This is something that Ed West observed in a panel earlier in the day. Someone had asked, again, a young Zoomer who was feeling rather pessimistic about integration, and perhaps because, like me, he went to school and saw organically at lunch tables segregation along racial and then intra-racial national lines. For example, the Nigerian kids wouldn't sit with the Ghanaian kids unless they were sitting there making fun of them as to debate which African nation was best, and there were always underlying tensions with the white kids, even though a lot of those kids were very nice, interpersonally, one-on-one, very friendly people. This Zoomer said, well, it's all well and good teaching children to appreciate Churchill, Chaucer, Shakespeare, but if they don't feel that these heroes, these British heroes, these British cultural icons belong to them because they do not feel a part of the people that innovated the culture in the first place, then what use is it to teach them of their heroes, of our heroes, as if they are their heroes, when they don't feel they are their heroes? And it's because the culture, the history, and the heroes of a people is the exclusive property of that people. And that people alone can decide whether or not to admit outsiders to becoming a member of their tribe. This is actually really well articulated. Larry Siedentop's book, Inventing the Individual, The Origins of Western Liberalism. So there's a section in the first chapter about the pre-modern tribes in the ancient city and the ancient family. And I'm just going to Just going to get that section up, because he provides us with a much more robust rendition of what national identity is according to how our ancestors lived. He says, "These beliefs in the sacred fire and divine ancestors, revealed by the study of the roots of the Greek and Latin languages, should not be dismissed as mere anthropological curiosities, for practices established by these beliefs survived, even if modified, into historical times as the domestic practices of Greece and Rome. Indeed, they established the framework of everyday life until the advent of Christianity." And there's a quote here. "In the house of every Greek and Roman was an altar. On this altar there had always to be a small quantity of ashes and a few lighted coals. It was a sacred obligation for the master of every house to keep the fire up night and day. Woe to the house where it was extinguished. Every evening they covered the coal with ashes to prevent them from being entirely consumed. In the morning the first care was to revive this fire with a few twigs. The fire ceased to glow upon the altar only when the entire family had perished. An extinguished hearth, an extinguished family were synonymous expressions among the ancients. The absolute authority of the eldest male, keeper of the sacred fire, and preserver of the family cult, later found expression as paterfamilias. His authority was a direct consequence of religious belief, and for any son to remain single was deemed to be a dereliction of duty because it was a threat to the immortality of the family. If we return to the example of a bride being carried across the threshold of a new home, we can now begin to understand the origins of the practice. In a world where the family was the only social institution and the family worship the source of personal identity, the move from one family to another was a truly momentous step for a young woman, a step that changed her identity completely. So what had to happen for a marriage to take place? First, the daughter had to be separated forever from her own family in a formal ceremony before its sacred fire. But in renouncing her family worship, she lost all identity. She became temporarily a non-person. That is why her future husband had to carry her across the threshold of his family house. Only when she had been received into the worship of her new family, in another solemn ceremony before their sacred fire, did she acquire a new identity, an identity that enabled her to enter and leave the house of her own accord. Now, once again, she had ancestors and a future. And they goes on, this primitive belief survived in practice centuries later when the Greeks and Romans first built cities, for while urban houses had to be much closer together, they could not be contiguous or joined. Some space, however slight, had to separate them. At Rome, the law fixed 2.5 feet as the width of the free space, which was always to separate the two houses, and this space was consecrated to the god of the enclosure. No doubt the building of tenements later compromised this prohibition, but it shaped Roman property law at the outset. Today, when we see other humans, we see them first of all as individuals with rights rather than family members, each with an assigned status. That is, we now see humans as rational agents whose ability to reason and choose makes it right to attribute to them an underlying equality of status, a moral equality. We are even inclined to see this moral equality as a fact of perception rather than a social valuation, so ingrained is our assumption that rational agency demands concern and respect. So, ancient family formation formed city-states. It formed tribes. Those tribes then came together as kinds of confederations to worship the same ancestors, and they worshiped the same ancestors by intermarrying and pouring out libations and burning offerings at the daily hearth, which was kept alive as a kind of duty, a deference to one's ancestors. I can't remember who it was. I think it was Chesterton who said that tradition is the democracy of the dead. And so you revere those who have made sacrifices before you to forge another chain in the long and continuous one of your civilization. A sort of very Burkean principle that tradition is what binds all people together, and that it connects you to your forefathers, and so you pass like a baton from your ancestors to your children that great burden of maintaining a tradition, but also you benefit from all of its wisdom. So this is to say that ancient nation-states were collections of tribes that intermarried, that worship the same ancestors, then the same conceptual gods. Think Aquae Sulis in Bath, for example, the goddess of Bath, the embodiment of the city, and who would plant their ancestors in the soil, and then if they went to found a new city-state, they would take a piece of their soil with them and plant that soil in the new city-state to ensure there is continuity between place, between ancestors, between tribe, between heritage, between nation. So the people comprise nations as a little bit of place and a little bit of culture, but both of those proceed from distinct peoples, from families, from ancestry. And so, like it or not, human civilizations have always been built by distinct peoples, ancestries, families, and so you can trace back through heritage to where you come from and which civilization you are more likely to feel that you belong to. And there are, of course, outliers, but those are exceptions that prove the rule. So, for contemporary conservatives to deny this because they feel icky about excluding some of their friends from the category English, which they have moralized because they are Westophiles and they have learned an awful lot about their own heritage, and they're to be lauded for that because we need people who are well educated to be custodians of that culture. Because they don't want to exclude their friends from that category they've moralized, they are breaking the civilizational chain and denying, as Seaton Top has written in his very good book, exactly how civilizations sprung up and were sustained in the first place. And so they have raced to adopting, as Robert Toombs has recommended, the Michaela school model of integration. Now, for those who aren't familiar, the Michaela School is presided over by Katherine Birbalsingh, dubbed Britain's strictest headmistress. She's a friend of Michael Gove and is put on a pedestal as an exemplar of how free schools that resulted from Michael Gove's reforms, his project, while working at the Department for Education in the Conservative Cameron government, she is championed as proof that they were an unalloyed good. And she governs the Michaela School, which has one of the lowest levels of white British pupils in any student cohort in the country. She has a very large volume of Muslim students, and so in order to, as she has said, make multiculturalism work, she has put a lot of downward pressure on the diversity, the fractured ethnic and cultural student body, the heterogeneous student body. She has put a lot of downward pressure on it to militantly enforce silence in corridors, strict discipline, secularism, and vegetarianism to ensure that we all eat as a family. And as I said at a speech in the Family Education Trust conference about a fortnight ago that actually followed Birbalsingh's own speech, to a free-thinking, boundary-testing, rambunctious Anglo boy like me, that sounds like hell. And the problem we have is that Katherine Birbalsingh's model of integration, the authoritarian headmistress dictating what is and isn't British values, and the egalitarian liquidation of ethnic and cultural differences to make a culture that supposedly accommodates all and can be adopted by second generation and third generation immigrants who are not so inclined to buy into our culture because they don't think it's theirs. This model of forceful integration is being recited as a prescription for the state writ large by the conservative intelligentsia and politicians. This is why anytime something happens in education, the likes of Spectator, Unheard, GB News often go to Katherine Birbalsingh for her advice. And I don't deny that Birbalsingh seems like a nice woman and that her methods get very strong exam results. But that is a few reasons. One, prying the smartphone away from any student is just going to improve their grades, which she does, much to the protesting of parents, but I think that's a good thing. And also, yes, some unruly students do benefit from discipline and higher levels of conformity. However, it is much better to have a spontaneous order, a bottom-up, organic, high-trust, low application of force culture than it is an enforced, top-down, headmistress-style panopticon. And what is being proposed here is, due to mass migration, due to cultural fracturing caused by multiculturalism as a kind of management strategy for migration, the idea is that the former, the spontaneous order of settled English culture, should be replaced with the latter, the militant secularism and ever-watchful state of the Michaela School model. And I think that just sounds like hell on earth. And I'm not pulling this I'm not scaremongering. I'm not fabricating this trend out of thin air. Kemi Badenoch, at her opening speech at ARC this year in February, she cited the Michaela School's lawsuit, their victory in a lawsuit brought against them by Muslim parents, as an example of the muscular secularism and liberalism required to quash multicultural sectarianism. For context, in 2023, a group of Muslim students began spontaneously praying in Michaela School's playground. They began acting as a kind of Sharia police by telling other students to dress in Islamic garb and observe Ramadan. And Katherine Birbalsingh responded to this by banning all prayer in schools. Now, reminder, we are not a secular country. We are still a Christian country, a fact that someone should probably inform the Anglican Church of, though as a Catholic, we're outnumbering you guys 2-1 among Gen Z. The trend's looking good. As Ash Sarkar once said, we're winning, lads. Anyway, we are not a secular country. We have never been a secular country. Robert Toombs knows this because Danny Kruger, in his speech at the Now in England event, cited Toombs to make the point that England was a Christendom long before it became a kingdom. It was, of course, the Venerable Bede who, in his great work, described all of the tribes and peoples of England to describe them as the English, the Angles. And it was in the first century, the first Archbishop of Canterbury in 597 AD, who sought guidance from Pope Gregory I and was told, preach against consanguinity, prevent first and second cousin marriage. And this is why these little platoons, these sort of nuclearized families, arose in England long before they did in many other nations. This is why, for centuries, it benefited from these breakdowns in clannish in-group loyalty long before the Catholic Church put the formal prohibition in. I think it was in the 13th century. So these family structures informed how the English think about morality. It allows them to universalize it a lot more. It informed the sort of high trust, spontaneous order, low levels of enforced compliance culture that allowed its markets to flourish. It allowed trade to be conducted on the basis of promises that were kept and upheld. A concept, again, that isn't widespread among the rest of the world. Wade Stott did a fantastic video recently on how the global village, the term that Marshall McLuhan came up for, to describe the homogenizing and interconnectivity phenomena that comes from information and communications technology, like the smartphone, social media, the internet. He said it's more like a global shantytown because the moment you interact with another culture like China or India or Nigeria, then you are exposed to their much lower levels of social trust and their much lower prohibitions against dishonesty, which means that, Western Christian countries have their elderly exploited by spam callers and spam email chains. The idea that all of these things aren't particular to England should be nonsensical to Toombs, given he wrote all of this in his book, but then throws out the idea that this is the product of a long and continuous chain of tradition, culture, custom, and family formation that can instead be condensed down to a curriculum and teach within not a generation, but within sort of 5 to 7 years at the Michaela School, can teach thousands of girls wearing hijabs to subordinate their Islamic identity and their ethnic identity to a British civic identity just by reciting Kipling. And also, on that, related to the family formation point, related to the cousin marriage point, because of course we're relitigating that in Parliament at the moment, because over half of Pakistanis in places like Bradford are married to a cousin. And this clannish loyalty, this asabaya, is actually at the root of the grooming gang scandal, because this is the reason why families, clans, networks not only ran the gangs and brothers, cousins, husbands, sons, often all the same thing, participated in the gangs, but also wives, sisters, mothers, and daughters covered for their relatives because they hated their outgroup. This is important to note because family formation, because culture, because ethnic and religious identity have a much greater hold over people and the pupils at Michaela School than anything they will be taught. And this is actually embodied by the fact they're wearing hijabs in the first place. This is the thing that I think the likes of Toombs don't really understand. They see religion as something which can be compartmentalized and privately observed and have no bearing on the public sphere. Just like someone's unorthodox sexual appetites can be confined purely to the bedroom, and when they step outside the bedroom, it's a magic portal, and it doesn't shape their personality at all and doesn't motivate them to either avoid that topic of conversation in all interactions or destigmatize their various fetishes to make sure they never feel shame in the first place. See pride. It's strange that Tombs doesn't understand this. Instead, he acts as if Islam is one among many religions on a cultural buffet that you can kind of pick and choose at will, rather than a comprehensive and competitive doctrine of the good that is incompatible with the English Christianity and customs, the settled culture of this land, which has been forced to accommodate it at the expense of the law-abiding, tax-paying native host majority who has never wanted this and voted against it at every opportunity. And the hijab itself is not just a visual marker of Islam, it is a visual marker of a wholly incompatible moral system being practiced. And so all of those moral priors, which would require one to buy into British identity, to have an affinity for Kipling, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Churchill, all of those things are not present. So everything that has been learned at the Michaela school could be cast aside like an old coat. And by not present, I mean you really have to understand the mindset that someone is in to enforce a hijab upon their daughter in primary school, their wife, anyone. The point of a hijab is to say that sexual assault is a woman's fault because if she dresses immodestly, she has provoked sin in a violent and predatory man. He was walking along, just observing the tenets of Islam, minding his own business, until he saw her ankle or her wrist or her hair and became overtaken by a fevered sexual rage. And so it's actually her fault. So she needs to dress modestly at all times so as to not provoke men and tempt them to sin. Now, we don't think like that. We think that our women are capable of equal moral dignity to men, and even though we have the ambiguous complementarity of gender differences, and it can be a source of playfulness and frustration between the sexes at times, and this is why the boomers themselves always have jokes about husbands and wives hating each other, but really loving each other. We don't think like the Islamic world do. We think that our women and girls are capable of equal moral dignity, and because of size and strength differentials between men and women, actually deserving of extra protection by good men who need to cultivate their strength to defend their family, their loved ones, and their civilization. We have a completely inverted way of thinking about things as the Islamic world, but Tombs doesn't understand that, and Tombs is still saying that a girl in a hijab reciting Kipling brings a tear to his eye. If only we could get more of this happening. The other problem with the Michaela school model is that in order to accommodate that, especially if applied at the level of the state, as the likes of Fraser Nelson, Kemi Badenoch, Katherine Birbalsingh herself might want, is that it requires the liquidation of the host majority identity to become leveled down to an equal playing field with the tribal ethno-religious minorities imported into the country that are rote learning how to be British or English. And one, people don't want this. It's very patronizing. I do not like any attempts to redefine my identity that comes naturally to me, because it sort of forces me to rationally justify it or abandon any pretense to exclusively own it. And especially if this comes from someone of immigrant heritage, it is very condescending. It's almost the inverse of the kind of thing that Konstantin Kisin has talked about before. I went back and forth with Konstantin on X about this phenomenon a little while ago, and Konstantin remains a friend, so we just disagree in good spirits here. But he said that a kind of realpolitik point, he thought that politicians like Kemi Badenoch are best suited to make the case for defending British identity because she has regime-approved diversity body armor as an immigrant, as a black woman, and so often it will take immigrants to show the British the way, because we have become so deracinated and distanced from our culture that it almost takes an outsider to come in and tell us what we're about and save us. And I think people derive a sense of flattery from that when it happens. This is why people like Constantine defending British identity and British culture so much, because it's nice to see someone who came over as an immigrant as a child be so grateful for this country having taken him in, and to lavish praise upon it. But for then the convert to be given access to the pulpit to then redefine what Britishness is, rather than defer to it, rather than learn what it is and praise it, to then expand the definition to encompass themselves and put themselves on an equal playing field with those who have inherited the identity, those to whom the identity comes most naturally. One, it's not just a falsehood that jars with people, because it's just a category error. Like, you're not English if your parents are not English. That's just a falsehood, not a moral judgment, but it's just a fact. But it's also, it feels like someone's trying to get one over on you by redefining your identity to encompass them, even if it is well-meaning because they actually quite like your identity. And so the third issue with this, again, is it desirable to want a Michaela school? Is it desirable to want to live under a surveillance regime that enforces silence in corridors, that enforces vegetarianism on all people because Hindus don't eat beef and Muslims don't eat, and Jews don't eat pork, and some religions are wholly vegetarian, so everyone just has to eat plant food as to not offend anyone? Is it desirable to completely compartmentalize our competing conceptions of the good and subordinate the one which has acted as the powerful substrate for all of the laws, customs, traditions that we hold dear and think are excellent, and to shove them away in the drawer, presuming as well that all other religions will do the same? And if they don't do it, then it requires the constant monitoring and arbitration by a state that's acting as a headmistress to make the host majority and imported tribal minorities play nice at all times. Is this a desirable state of affairs? Is it a sustainable state of affairs? I mean, this is the third proper reason why people objected so much to what Tombs said. The hour is way too late and the threat way too large for these insufficient suggestions, these patently false renditions of national identity and integration strategies to be suggested. When David Betts and Dominic Cummings are warning of the imminent likelihood of civil war within the next 5 years, based on a comprehensive reading of the literature on urban warfare, based on security briefings in number 10 Downing Street, and they're saying, look, it doesn't matter whether or not you as an ethnic minority believe in British values, because these life or death interactions in a urban skirmish environment are not going to go on long enough to interrogate you as to how many Keats quotes you can throw out. Instead, the people are just going to take a look at you, see that you don't look like them, and make a snap judgment. And so that means that actually, the immigrants and minorities that have been accepted into the tribe and maybe even married a British person might fall on the wrong side of that tribal judgment, something that none of us want, by the way. If they're making all those warnings, then stop yammering about the Michaela school. Stop blabbering about how sentimental and misty-eyed you get because some girl in a hijab can quote Kipling. I mean, it is not good enough. Things are really, really dire, and we are building towards a situation of unrecoverable violence along ethnic lines, not along Islam and British values, as David Betts told Andrew Gold recently, but people making snap judgments on complexion alone. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is actually because despite what I am judged as being by the likes of Anaya Falar and Aman in slanderous spike pieces, I have a very individualistic, congenial liberal temperament when it comes to getting along with people. I grew up going to school and living next to African families. One of my parish priests is a chap, I think he's from Zimbabwe. I've always thought that West Africans in particular have quite a warm, West African Christians have quite a warm disposition. I seem to have gotten along with them. So I don't make snap judgments along racial lines. You can make predictable judgments about people from certain nationalities and how they would behave. For example, I neither does Ayaan Hirsi Ali, by the way. I don't expect much in terms of philosophical or scientific innovation from the Somali expat community in Britain, given 72% of them are living in social housing. I think it's a pretty predictable pattern that Pakistanis will have barbaric views of our women and girls. I think it's fair to think that Albanians are pretty likely to become drug dealers and gang members, and so we should just deter all of the foreign nationals and not let any more in. However, I would quite like a civilization where the admittedly vanishingly small, but still some members of other countries who do have a real affinity for our culture, customs, and heritage, and who fall in love with a member of our tribe, can get married and can join the tribe, and whose descendants become an actually assimilated, indistinguishable constituent of our isles, who feels grateful to live here and who comes to call this place their own. It would be really nice to have that, but that is a luxury that one has only when they understand that we exist as a distinct people in whose interests our state, our politicians, our culture should act. And without that distinct people, without that distinct culture, without that distinct state, what are outsiders meant to be assimilating into? What are they joining? They're just instead becoming one among many cogs in a well-oiled market, or another grey goo integer stumbling around the landmass of the British Isles, signing up to modish British values which don't actually mean anything, like tolerance and the rule of law. Basically, you're swearing fealty to a state that manages you sufficiently. So I think the Michaela school vision of the country is dystopic, and it is an unhealthy addiction that many of our politicians and conservative intelligentsia have hooked themselves up to. But the final point I will make on this is, and it is really elucidated by a new policy announced by Reform UK on the same day, no political party is speaking up in the interests of that distinct British people. So Zia Yusuf came out and did a video on Reform UK's accounts announcing the new Britannia card. And it's patriotic because he called it Britannia, by the way, and using old footage of London before the mass migration of the Second World War, Tony Blair's premiership, and the Boris wave demographically and culturally scarred this country and economically impoverished it. And he announced that the new Britannia card under a reform government would be essentially a visa that you could pay a one-off large fee, I think it was like £250,000, as a wealthy foreigner, come over, live here, and not have to pay tax. And it is designed to attract the world's so-called best and brightest. And the problem that you have is that this is just the wing of neoliberalism that will actually achieve economic growth rather than egalitarian redistribution. It's still acting on a purely materialistic political axis. And it can't define who the party is supposed to be representing, because it is treating everyone from everywhere as a Brit in waiting, and Britain itself as an entity is not the home of a distinct people who practice a distinct culture, whose activities register as a distinct economy, because the economy originally came from the oikos, the home, and the nomos, which governed it, were the rules which governed homes and households, which were, again, the basis of tribes and then city-states. The economy is not, the culture is not, the nation is not, and the party is not bound up in people. Instead, it just thinks of Britain as a shopping mall, a retail park, an economic zone, a way station for the moneyed international class. And this is just the inverse of the demented redistributive mindset of the likes of Gus O'Donnell, quoted in David Goodhart's The Road to Somewhere, who told him at a dinner in Oxford in 2010 that when he was Chief Secretary to the Treasury, he advocated for the most generous and open borders immigration system possible because he believed his commitment was to, quote, global welfare. It's the same mentality that someone, Louise Perry, knows, and she's told this story before, but also a utilitarian on a live stream recently said, the same mentality that says, well, it's actually a good thing to have the Pakistani grooming gangs in Britain rather than in Pakistan, because they'd still be committing the same sexual abuse against their own girls, but it's better to commit it against British girls because we have a justice system that can actually take it and diminish the number of attacks.
I'd expect that much the same crimes would be done in Pakistan, and I'm far happier that they are doing them in Britain, where there is a modern police force that would be more likely to arrest them. And I think the total amount of crime in the world would have gone down by allowing grooming
So hang
gangs
on.
to immigrate to Britain.
Sorry, okay, can you repeat that? So you're saying it's better that grooming gangs go to Britain because the British police force is a modern police force, and therefore there's overall in sort of like net utilitarian terms, there's less grooming gangs in the world or something. Is that your argument?
Yeah. Yes. Why?
Really?
What's wrong with it? I am entirely unapologetically somebody who cares about total utility and not one country over another.
Not only is this not true because the justice system worked to cover it up because they were afraid of being called racist and to protect the Pakistani heritage community, and because Pakistanis themselves only commit these crimes because of in-group preference and out-group hatred along familial, clannish, ethnic and religious lines, but it's also abhorrent because every single act of violence committed against a British national is a consequence of state policy and is committed by someone who never needs to be in the country in the first place. Every single penny of taxpayer cash spent on illegal or legal migrants alike is a theft from the hard work of the native British population spent on someone who never needs to be in this country in the first place. And it's premised on a universalist reading of human nature as tabula rasa, blank slate, which means that if you just take a man from here and bring him to here, give him enough money, give him a sufficient education, inculcate and enrich him in British values, that he will become indistinguishable from you and me. It is the premise of a propositional nation like America. Now, much to be debated about that. I'm with Samuel Huntington on this, that America is not a nation of immigrants, per the John F. Kennedy and Anti-Defamation League phrase and book from the 50s, but is rather a nation of settlers. So it comes from a distinct people, that is Anglo-Protestants, WASPs, from fleeing the religious wars of Europe and who rocked up at Plymouth Rock on the Mayflower and, as Governor John Winthrop said in his Massachusetts Bay sermon, wanted to craft America as a shining city on a hill, a new Jerusalem, a Christian kingdom fit for the Anglos, to whom the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights premises were self-evident because they had practiced a distinct culture. It was familiar to them, therefore they thought it was universal and befitting all. This is a very American premise, a very propositional nation premise, because it presumes that you just need to take someone from somewhere and have them live by the rules that would be fit to make a society of rational devils, as Kant once said, and they will instantly become British. And British is itself just a economic, legal and cultural identity, not an identity conferred through ancestry, lineage, tradition, custom. And we know this is how Reform think about things, because Zia Yusuf himself, when the burqa debate was unfolding, when he stormed off as chairman and came back as head of UK Doge after Sarah Pochen said she wanted to ban the burqa, said that he would be uncomfortable with the burqa ban, but if he were asked to vote for it when he eventually becomes an MP and is given a safe seat, which he's been promised, by the way, he would vote for it. But he said he's uncomfortable with proposing a burqa ban because he's uncomfortable banning things that would not be banned under America's First Amendment. Now, there are lots of things to like about the First Amendment. The Brandenburg Principle, as laid out by a Supreme Court case, I believe it was, is something that the UK should emulate to ensure the likes of Lucy Connolly, Peter Lynch, Judy Sweeney, Wayne O'Rourke, and the thousands of other people every year who are arrested and charged and imprisoned for social media posts and public order offences, to ensure that they are never persecuted for their speech again, alongside all the Christians arrested and charged with praying silently in their own head outside abortion clinics to honour the murdered children there. It would be great to adopt that, but betraying his mindset there, Zia Yusuf thinks of, and therefore Reform UK at large, think of the UK as America. It's an economic zone. It's a place where anyone from anywhere can rock up, and as long as they pay their fees and have done their paperwork and recite the Scouts' pledge of British values, just like in America, if you pass a civics test, you become an American citizen, or you become British, a British citizen. You become as indistinguishably English as someone who can trace their lineage back to the Venerable Bede. This is not what Reform UK supporters want. This is not what the electorate more broadly want in their revealed preferences. What they acknowledge is the British are a distinct people. Yes, they can accommodate some neighbours from around the world, but that's on a relational basis. If they live next to them, if they do them some sort of service as a doctor or a nurse or an engineer or something, and they often marry someone who is themselves ethnically of this place, and they bring their children up to be friends with their children and to become custodians of the culture. The English don't object to that. This is why they have the highest registered levels of tolerance in multiple polls of having neighbours of a different ethnicity, for example, of allowing their children to marry someone of a different ethnicity, and they have much lower levels of ethnic in-group preference than imported tribal minorities. Same for white Americans in America versus Hispanics, Asians, and Black Americans as well. This is not the issue. The issue is that people want a country that feels familiar to them. They want a country that is filled with neighbours and friends and faces they recognise and are therefore predictable, and so they don't have to feel on edge all the time. They don't have to suspect whether or not these people who showed up yesterday they can never hope to get to know have ill intent for them. They want a high trust and homogenous culture again. And just turning the UK into basically Dubai by allowing the international business class to buy their way into the country does not generate that. But Reform can only talk in purely economic terms because they cannot identify a distinct British people to which they think their party should have loyalty, even though they are topping the polls, slipping slightly in polling at the moment because of, I think, recent missteps, but nevertheless, topping the polls because they stand in for that populist, patriotic, immigration skeptic party who puts the British people first. And to put them first, you have to define a distinct British people, not just, as Tim Stanley quipped in his Telegraph piece recently on Brits becoming a minority in their own country, people who don't murder and pay their taxes. Reform think that's their constituency. It's not, and it is insufficient to govern for, because being British, as in having that lineage, abiding by that culture, buying into the faith that undergirds common law, Blackstone's formulation, all of our customs and traditions, being all of those things are the prerequisites, the enabling conditions for all of the things that Reform wants, which is a deregulated market, a high trust culture, economic prosperity, social peace and cohesion, low crime. All of these things are enabled by cultural, religious, and, at least at a large volume, ethnic homogeneity. And none of these are moral condemnations of people who would like to come to this country or just exist in other countries. I'm not morally condemning the Japanese, and I'm not trying to culturally terraform Japan, even as a Christian, because I go to Japan, and will be later this year again, because I love Japanese culture, and I like being in Japan, and I like Japanese people. So in the same way, we should identify the distinct culture, the distinct traditions, the distinct religion, and the distinct people of Britain, and someone should represent them. There is basically a massive open flank in politics to do this. Now, I know some politicians are interested in doing this and eager to do so, and actually, other than Rupert Lowe, Robert Jenrick has been the rhetorically strongest on this. He wrote a Mail piece a little while ago saying that English identity is being erased, and yes, British identity is a legal fiction that has been invented to encompass originally the four identities of the British Isles, so that's English, Welsh, Scottish and Irish, but now some of the people that we have historic ties to in the Commonwealth as a legacy of the Empire. I think you're going to see the Commonwealth wither and die away, by the way, because demographic realities have just have really soured Gen Z and successive generations as they come up on the Commonwealth nations. Like, we have no great affinities for India because Indian culture is not good and very distant from ours, and the love of the Commonwealth is a sort of boomer hangover that will go the way of the dodo. Point being, Robert Jemrick has said, yeah, it's all well and good to have this fiction, but I'm an Englishman. My English identity is still very strong to me. It's a natural love which I should not have to rationally justify or get rid of to accommodate new outsiders who have nothing but contempt for us. But even Jemrick at this event, and he gave a good speech, don't get me wrong, and called himself an Anglo-futurist, which means that he recognises the Anglos as a distinct people capable of greatness compared to other nations. But even he turned around at the after party and tapped Robert Toombs on the shoulder and shook his hand, and then, like some sort of portent from the gods, turned to the group that was standing outside the bar when this interaction happened and said, "This man taught me everything I know," which means that our political class, almost collectively, still have no idea what time it is. And they better realize it soon. Because not only is there a great political opportunity just laying on the table, waiting for them to take, which it looks like Reform UK is not keen on doing. I mean, for example, they didn't understand the bad optics of allowing their Muslim former chairman to announce brand new buy your way into Britain visas for wealthy foreigners, while still not having delivered their mass deportation policy as announced and promised from right before the election. Not only did Reform UK not understand that massive optics blunder, which means that they're just habitually not representing the British people who are under siege, demographically, culturally, economically, you name it. But also, again, the hour is far too late for this. We are on the precipice of preventable civil conflict along ethnic lines. I don't want that to happen. One of my most salient early political moments was the London riots when they came near my road as a kid. It was awful. And to know now that this would be far more violent, far more widespread, and result in a hell of a lot of deaths, according to David Betts' calculations, is awful. It's preventable if a political solution arises and if someone has sufficient courage to speak in these terms. And as of yet, nobody does. As of yet, we're only getting the likes of Robert Toombs say, the Michaela school is our future. I don't want to live in South Africa or Liberia or Lebanon, but I equally don't want to live in the Longhouse or the headmistress-dominated panopticon that is being offered as a solution to the destruction of our settled host majority culture by unwanted mass immigration and multiculturalism. And look, if these are the sacrifices we're going to have to make multiculturalism work, as Birbalsingh says, then I'm sorry. It's multiculturalism and immigration, not English identity, that has to give way. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. Thought I'd just do a sort of philosophical discussion episode because we need to start thinking about putting things in these terms. And these events are very important, by the way. Never forget that it was essentially the continued war of attrition against conservative Inc. resting on their laurels in America that led the Trump administration to adopt the popular vote-winning position and the morally good position of mass deportations. And even now, the Trump administration occasionally signals its desire to squish. Think Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy with H-1B visas last December, or Trump even recently saying maybe we should make exemptions for deportations for seasonal agriculture workers and service staff in restaurants, and the likes of Warren McIntyre and Jack Posobiec going, no, hold the line, and ensuring Stephen Miller fulfills the promise of removing all of the foreign criminals from America. Good on you. We need the same thing over in Britain. And the Matt Walsh-esque question, what is an Englishman, will be continued to be asked at these events of politicians and academics until they get a better answer than, well, you can learn to be English via the Michaela School, or as David Bull said, Britain is a nation of immigrants. Thank you very much for watching. I'll be back next week. Till then, take care and goodbye.